Hey friends, this is Scott, and I've got a word from a new sponsor, and a really cool sponsor, in fact, that I use myself. They are Seek. That's S-E-Q, and you can check them out at getseek.net. That's G-E-T, S-E-Q.net. Seek is the easiest way for your team to capture and search and visualize structured log events. You probably do logging. Maybe you have a Node app or an ASP.NET Core app. Move beyond text files. Check out structured logging. It preserves those individual property values as well as the text that's associated with each event. They get sent across the network to Seek, which then displays them and makes them searchable. It's really easy to get started. You can probably instrument your application if you're already using logging in just minutes. Just go to getseek, that's G-E-T, seq.net. You install the Seek server. It's a Windows service, and then it listens and handles all of the logging, whether you're using Node.js and the Bunyan logging library, or maybe you use Serilog on .NET, or just ASP.NET Core's built-in logging. Seek is there for whatever you want to use, whether it be .NET or Node or Python or Java. It's a really great product, and I encourage you to check them out and support them the way that they support us here at Hansel Minutes. Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today I'm talking with Ahmed Abdalla from New York. How are you, sir?
Doing pretty well. Can't complain. How are you?
I'm very well and happy to be chatting with you. So you're a software engineer, working software engineer. You've been a software engineer for many years, but I bumped into you online when I saw you teaching a new programming language to kids. And what's interesting about it is called Noor, and it is written in Arabic. Is that a language that you speak at home?
Yes. So I was born in Sudan in Africa, and I moved to the U.S. when I was 9 years old. So my first language is actually Arabic. Sudan is one of the few African, maybe not the few African countries, one of some set of African countries where people speak Arabic as the primary language. And when we moved to the United States, my parents spoke Arabic as their stronger language, so we ended up speaking a lot of Arabic at home. It's a good medium for us to communicate with our parents. It's very interesting is that our parents also didn't want us to lose our ability to speak Arabic, but it's something that's inevitable when you move from one country to another, where you're not going to be speaking a different language. And so as we were getting older, we started to get much, me and my siblings started to get much better in speaking Arabic or speaking English, and the Arabic just started to whittle down. So our parents started ordering the textbooks for Arabic, school back home and having them shipped here so they can teach us. So it was they've been fighting hard to maintain it, and it's something now as an adult I'm kind of really glad I have.
Yeah. Would you say you're fluent, or are there levels of fluency?
I would say I'm pretty fluent in speaking orally. I think my reading and writing can definitely use some improvement. And I think that's just a result of having gone to part of elementary, middle school, high school, college here. And it was all in English. And I never took an Arabic class because I knew a lot of the basics that were taught in Arabic courses. I think one thing that is definitely an area that I could improve at is certainly my classical Arabic and modern standard Arabic.
But if you got a copy of The Martian in Arabic, you'd be no problem? You could read the whole novel?
It depends on how The Martian is written. If it's modern standard Arabic, it might be a little bit difficult, but I think I'd be able to get through it.
Okay. So now you're a programmer, and what are the languages that you program in your kind of day job?
So right now I primarily use Java, JavaScript. Before that I used a lot of Python and JavaScript. So those are the two, three languages I've worked a lot with.
And at what point did you have an inspiration to say that I want to see what a programming language looks like that doesn't use standard English or standard Latin characters?
So this happened about several years ago. There's a programmer in Brooklyn released an Arabic programming language called Qalb, or pronounced in his dialect is called Alb. And the name of the language means heart. And I saw the language on Hacker News. It was posted that day. And I thought it was just super cool. And I was like, whoa, somebody created an Arabic programming language. And I never thought that would be possible. And, in my head, it was like, whoa, this is the first Arabic programming language ever. And then at the time, one thing about that language was it was a functional Lisp style Arabic programming language. And at the time, I'd been doing a lot of Python programming, and before that, even a little bit of Java programming. And so I was fully like in this object-oriented, imperative, procedural sort of world. And I was like looking at, Qalb, and I was like, I think this is a great idea, and I think it would be like super great if like Arabic-speaking kids could like have access to an Arabic programming language to learn the fundamentals of computer science. But this thing is it's a Lisp, and I didn't feel that the functional or Lisp languages were so intuitive. And of course, that was my ignorance at the time, because at the time I hadn't like gone deep into working with functional programming languages. And one of the things as I would go about in creating Noor, my Arabic programming language, is I would end up studying functional programming language to understand that. But before that, I was just like, this ignorance about functional programming, especially like this Lisp style, was like, I want to take a different approach to this. And I think this idea really has some serious potential to it. And some of the things that really motivated me was, I think Qalb came out around 2013. Remember around that time, there's just like this huge surge for, let's get everybody to learn how to code. Let's make programming super accessible. I think maybe about a year or two before that is when Coursera and Udacity were created. So like this whole revolution of let's jump into learning computer science online and for free just really started picking up. And one of the things that sort of struck me is that to learn computer programming, you basically have to know how to speak in English, and you have to be pretty fluent. I think one of the things at the time is a lot of the teaching material is in English, a lot of documentation is English. If you're running a compiler for a language and you get an error, that error and that stack trace is all in English. It's like it takes a pretty serious amount of fluency in English to be able to learn coding, to read docs and like bootstrap yourself. And I remember like, there were these businesses like Code Academy and a few others that were, trying to make learning programming super easy for folks, and they would make it interactive, and it was on the web, so you don't have to download and install anything. It sort of struck me that, like maybe everybody who can speak English will be able to learn how to program, except for the people that don't know how to speak English. And personally, I was born in a village in Sudan, so I was like really poor, right? So like,
so like not in like the downtown apartments.
Oh God, no. So like in my village in Sudan, it was probably when I was like 6 years old that we got electricity. In the same village as like around the year 2000 that they got landlines and phones. So it's like part of this village is like mud houses and dirt roads, and the other part is like brick. I think there was maybe one person in the town who might have had a toilet. So for me, I've always had this like attachment, but it's kind of like my early upbringing is just this really poor, environment. And of course I didn't know it was poor until I moved to the US with my parents, and I was like, whoa, this is heaven. But before then, that was my life. And so growing up, I sort of like thought back to the people I came from, and the people who don't have those opportunities. And when I think of English specifically, I think just about I don't want to say every country, but I can certainly say for Sudan that teaching English is one of the most important skills in the educational system. And I think like at my village, it was like around 5th grade, they would attempt to teach people English. But it was like not very good, and the curriculum is already terrible, and there's not a lot of funding. If you went to an English or American school in Sudan, you would come with a super solid understanding of the English language. You'd probably come speaking English without an accent. There's just it's like a very immersive experience into a language that has quite frankly, a lot of opportunity. Opportunity for professional development, for university education abroad, but also, as I started to think about it, when Qalb came out, it's also the language. English is the language you need to get into programming. And so when I saw Qalb, of course, at the time, I didn't know how to create a programming language. I've never attempted to create a programming language. And I'm a self-taught developer. So a lot of the things I picked up were relevant to the job and my work. And so then one day I decided to apply to the Recurse Center, which is a place here in New York City. It's like a writer's retreat for programmers. And basically people take about 3 months off from their work, and they come and work on any project they want. And so, of course, in my head, I was like, like that Arabic programming language idea I really wanted to work on. I think this might be a good place to do it. And so I came to the Recurse Center, and of course, I have zero background in creating programming languages, didn't know where to start. And I bumped into a recurser at the time, Ken Pratt, a really good friend of mine. He pointed me to this really good book called Create Your Own Programming Language, and I can give you a link to the book later on. And so I read this book, and it talks about how it gives you the understanding you need to build a programming language. And I think this is the same book that helped Jeremy Ashkenazi create CoffeeScript. So I'm like, oh, this book must be legit because, if Jeremy Ashkenazi was inspired to create CoffeeScript after reading this book, it'll totally help me in, picking up all the fundamentals. So between this book and a few other programming language books, I pieced together what I needed to know about how programming languages work in terms of, you have a grammar file and you have a parser and lexer and you have interpreter, compiler, all these nitty-gritty things you need to build a programming language. And I started off at the time after I finished reading this book and a few other books, I told myself I'm going to write my own lexer, write my own parser. I don't need to use any tools, Yak, Lex, none of these things.
That's a little bold right there, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's.
I'm just saying, let me rephrase. I apologize. I mean more like lexer, like parser, like that's the least fun part of doing a programming language. Like coming up with the keywords and the structure, doing the actual byte for byte parsing, that's no fun.
Right. Well, so for me, I was like, look, I need to be able to control every aspect of this because, I'm dealing with Arabic text and I don't know what issues will come up, but I want to have full control of.
That is a very good point. There's a lot of times where you might assume that the text is going to be parsed a certain way. And of course, programming languages and lexers and yackers often think about things byte for byte, but Arabic, not only right to left, but the byte arrays are UTF-8.
Yes. And actually, even before I attempted to create my own parser and lexer, one of the experiments I did is I thought, well, maybe I can just convert an existing English programming language to Arabic, and maybe that would just solve the job. And of course, I wanted a language to be algo based, a little bit, imperative. And so I went with Python. And so I cloned Python locally, went into the grammar file, and I added Arabic keywords to the grammar file, compiled it, ran my interpreter, and I punched my Arabic keywords in the REPL, and I didn't get, they didn't register. They didn't evaluate into anything. And so I tried different English keywords for the same Python grammar file, and those different keywords work just fine. So I knew that if I edited the grammar file, compiled the language, everything's smooth. And just after a little bit more research, I basically came to realize that the lexer parser for Python doesn't support the parsing of non-ASCII characters. And so while the language that's at the top does support, does have support for UTF-8 and Unicode, in the grammar file I couldn't get it, and I think it's probably perhaps because it's a really old technology. Perhaps it wasn't an idea that was thought of at the time or needed. So I didn't try. And even if I had been able to get it, and even if there was just something I missed, and maybe it really is doable, there's another level of concern I had, which is, Python, the structure of it still goes from left to right. And if I write an Arabic keyword, def, if I write that in Arabic and it goes from right to left, then the next word is going to have it to be to the right of that. So it's you'll have certain keywords going from right to left, but the language flow is still from left to right. And I thought that just converting a few keywords here and there might not really do it.
Right.
I might just have to start from scratch and go from there. And so, of course, after you read a book, like any programmer, you think, wow, I can do anything now. I read this book and I know how this works.
Yeah.
And let's just say about after a week or two of writing my own parser and lexer, I was just all right, this is just too much. It's just too many bugs and off by one errors. I just I don't want to deal with this. So that's when I really started to think about, maybe I really should use something else to do this. And I started looking into, the various tools that I had read about, but none of them really, I think the one that appealed to me the most at the time was PEG.js. And PEG.js is a parser expression and grammar and PEG.js is implemented in JavaScript. And PEGs are these grammar formalism. I don't really know how to describe it that well. It's basically a tool that generates compilers for you. So what you do is you give it your grammar file and
it's similar to the way Lex and Yak works. You basically are writing in your PEG. You can go to pegjs.org/online. You can see it actually in place where you write the grammar. You say this is an expression, and that's a factor, and that's an integer, and this is a term, and you're using their language to generate code in your language.
Right. And the grammar is like an EBNF grammar of you'll have like these recursive definitions of how your grammar is broken down into like the base atoms. And so I started off by creating.
If I may, just before you move on, to be sure, he just said EBNF. That means extended Bacchus-Naur form, and it's part of a meta syntax family of notations. It's a very, very old grammar that's now a standard. So Peg.js is using that EBNF grammar style, correct?
Yes.
Just want to give the context because not everybody knows what that acronym means.
No, definitely. Thank you for that.
Of course.
So I started creating my grammar file, and as I'd add different rules and into the grammar file, I would then run it through Peg.js, and I would get an abstract syntax tree. So Peg.js will generate the compiler, and then you take your language source code, and you run it through the compiler, and what you get out of it is the abstract syntax tree. And then it's up to the developer to take that abstract syntax tree and evaluate it, interpret it as they wish. And so my language being implemented in JavaScript, I would just take the different nodes and in this abstract syntax tree, and like if this was a function invocation, then that means this is the part of the language where somebody's trying to call a function. And so I would do the necessary parts of calling a function if I had to look up variables from the stack. At this point, it just like gets into like the details of implementing an interpreter or a language. I think one of the things that like was also an option for me at the time was to perhaps compile my language to another language like JavaScript itself and have like JavaScript run the JavaScript code, like let V8 or Node run JavaScript code. So like basically transpiling my language to another language, but that wasn't the choice I had chosen to do at the time. So there's like a lot of options, but I think using a tool like Peg.js was just super helpful. And I think now there's another tool that I came across called Ohm. And if I had to go back, I would especially look into Ohm. Ohm is also Peg-based compiler generator that has a lot of utilities to help you like debug and introspect the language and the grammar that you're generating and building.
Hey folks, Intel is a sponsor this week, and I welcome them because they're bringing some high-performance developer tools for all of us. Check out Intel's Parallel Studio XE. I've talked about parallelism before on the show and the importance of using the complete instruction set, unlocking the power of the processor that your code is running on. Now, you all might be writing C or C++, Python, or even Fortran, but is your code building in such a way and written in such a way that it uses the latest techniques for vectorization, multi-threading, multi-node parallelization, or memory optimization? Intel Parallel Studio XE has a lot of new stuff for 2018 across all these languages. Get a free download at bit.ly.com/parallelstudioxe, or certainly go and Google with Bing for Intel Parallel Studio XE, and get started boosting your app's performance with smart, parallel code with a lot less effort. Check them out, bit.ly.com/parallelstudioxe. When you did this the first time, were you thinking it would be entirely Arabic, including Arabic equivalents for numbers? Even though we're all using the Arabic numeral system, like, did you want the whole thing to be as Arabic as possible and stay in the Arabic typefaces and the Arabic style? Or do you have anything where you switch into, like, if you use like numbers, are you using the Arabic numerals, or are you going to just put in like 4?
So I didn't get into the part of supporting the numbers in like the Arabic numerals. To clarify, like the Arabic numerals are as you mentioned earlier, are the ones we use, and the numerals used oftentimes in the Arabic world are like what are called like the Indian numerals.
Yeah.
And so it uses the Indian numerals as the numbers in the language. If you wanted, I didn't yet get around to adding support for like English numerals or Arabic numerals.
Do you think those kind of things matter? Like, I understand that there's lots of languages where they have a great language, like Ethiopian Amharic is one I'm very familiar with. Their numeral system, though, is so goofy that a lot of Ethiopians are just like, forget it. We'll just use like American numerals, or standard English numerals. It's just easier. Or do you think when doing a language that is not English, there's value in kind of pushing aside all of the Western things and trying to see if you can do it the whole way in that local language?
So I think for me, a lot of the things that were guiding my decisions, a lot of the values were how would I have learned to use this language if I was a little kid? Would this language have taught me to program?
As a learning journey. Yeah.
As a learning journey. That's really what I was trying to answer as I was making different decisions. And when it comes to the numerals, I first started off with supporting the Indian numerals, which are what I used back when I grew up. That was where the common number systems. But I also did understand the Arabic numerals that we use here today, commonly in the U.S. And so they were like further away, but they weren't like, oh, I would never have this because it has to be this way or it needs to be that way. But it was more like from the first person view of me as a little kid, what was familiar to me at the time.
Right. And the idea that like a computer understands me. Like people who speak only English who are listening should use this as an opportunity to think outside their box and think to themselves, what if computers and the internet and the thing that is taking over the world, tech, didn't speak my language? Like, what does that feel like? Because a lot of people, and I wrote an article about this 10 years ago called "Do You Have to Know English to Be a Programmer?" It's become the lingua franca, which is funny because that's French, of the internet. But is that okay? Because it is such a barrier. It really isn't just a matter of learning 10 keywords, is it?
Yeah. And I think relative to the way I grew up in Sudan, to be fluent in English, you basically had to be wealthy. There's a lot of people in Sudan that don't have access to like great American schools, great English schools, international schools, where you can come with a really strong English background. And so for me, it was just sort of thinking like, no, I was too poor. I grew up too poor to have been able to learn programming by myself if I had come to be a teenager and I was interested in it. And I thought a lot of like the concepts in computer science, looping, functions, arithmetic, all these different concepts are pretty language agnostic. They're just algorithms that you can learn, and regardless of the medium, one is able to learn them. And I knew that, even if I had like created the perfect language experience, you would still need to learn English to be able to build anything significant because, the whole stack, in a computer is based on, you need to know English. There's no way around it. But I think to get people started, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I do want to dig in, though, to a couple of other things before we run out of time, thinking about some of the criticisms that were very valid and interesting online. But I was looking through the source code before we get into that, and I noticed something interesting where you made a change when you're describing a function or a worker. You have both the male and the feminine, the masculine and the feminine. And in English, we don't really think about nouns or things having gender. But virtually every other language in the world does have this idea of like, a TV is a man and a pen is a woman. And you have two keywords then to describe a function or a worker. Yes.
That's something I was thinking about is, if you were a little kid, with a little boy, a little girl, how would it impacted you if everything was done from the perspective of like these masculine objects? And I just wasn't sure. And it's kind of like, I could have it go either way. And so when I think of like the way to define a function, it's I'm trying to describe it in like kid-like talk or toy talk, which is, I said, instruct a worker. And I'm trying to think, is this worker, a male worker or a female worker? And I'm like, well, it's a grammar file. I can update it to have both, and I'll figure that out later. What's ideal, what's not ideal? Was this even a necessary debate? And so I don't have the final answer to that, as I just wanted it to be inclusive.
Yeah. And that is interesting because it does, as we are saying before, if you're experiencing computers for the first time and they are things that are inherently English, that's going to make you feel some kind of way. And if you got introduced to a language as a young Arabic speaking girl and then everything is a male noun, you might feel some kind of way. We don't know what that is, but it closes the door just a little bit tighter.
Definitely. And I think also on the point of criticism regarding the grammar and the keywords, a lot of the grammar choices I'd made were from the perspective of my own Sudanese dialect and the words I had learned to speak. And for people not familiar with the Arabic language and Arabic speaking countries, is that normally there's like a local dialect to a given country. So like in Sudan, we have our own dialect. In Syria, they have their own dialect. In Egypt, they have their own dialect. Gulf Arabic countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Dubai, the UAE in general, they all have their own, like, pretty similar yet different Arabic dialects. And these are dialects that are just local to those countries and those groups. And then you have what's known as modern standard Arabic, which is like it's like a form of Arabic it's the Arabic it's the formal Arabic. It's the one you would use in the news. It's the one you would write and publish books and essays in. It's the one you would go to court and draft contracts with.
Right.
You have classical Arabic, which is like this really, really old Arabic. You can sort of think of it as like Shakespearean English. It's still very important, very rich, but it's also not something people use day to day.
Not how people chat on the street.
Right. And so in general, in the Arabic world, when you create a piece of work and you want it to be transferable, you would sort of do it you would probably choose modern standard Arabic because it's just something people in all the different countries will get taught or, can get taught. They have access to.
Is this something where, like, I, as an American, go and I write something and I use like elevator and apartment, and then I send it off to England, and they're like, no, it should be lift and flat, or
right.
Is it more than that?
It's very similar to that. It can be more than that in that there's a lot of Arabic speaking countries, and sometimes the dialects diverge, really heavily. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I can understand Egyptian Arabic pretty well. I can understand Syrian or Levantian, or that area is called like Asham. I can understand their Arabic pretty well. I can start in Gulf Arabic pretty well, but I absolutely cannot understand Moroccan Arabic or Algerian, or because it's just so heavily like mixed with French, and they've just got their own take on a lot of different words that It's just not something I'm not all familiar with.
Well, as someone whose family's from Scotland, I feel the same way about my Scottish uncles and aunts, and they're all speaking. They tell me they're speaking English, but who knows?
Yeah.
Now, one thing that was interesting is we put this out on Twitter, and it turned into a very, very interesting conversation because a lot of my followers on Twitter from Arabic-speaking countries, and even just now as we're speaking, I put an article out and asked a couple of questions, and I have one gentleman from Sudan who was talking about the language that was your inspiration, Qalb, and he was saying how funny he thought it was that the gentleman who created Qalb wrote the word lambda rather than writing it as lambda. He wrote it in transliterated Arabic, which isn't a word. It spells out lambda, so someone who could read Arabic would go, "Oh, lambda," but you still have to know what that is, which seems so funny to me, given that Arabs created algebra.
Yeah, so it's a lot of words that are like in use today in a lot of different sciences and math. I don't want to say that there isn't an Arabic equivalent. It's just maybe one that we haven't come across. And I think one of the tricky things is like, if you come across like an iPhone, like what is an iPhone? Like what is, in English, it sort of makes sense. There's the letter I, meaning me.
Yeah.
There's the word phone. And like, do you transliterate that into,
So here's a funny like random thing. So my wife speaks Zulu, a dialect called Ndebele at home, and if you spell iPhone before the iPhone existed, it says iPhone, which means the phone. Yeah. So if I was sitting with her and I would say, "Hand me the phone," I would say telephone, and now it's like iPhone. So now, like, do we put two I's? Is it iPhone? Like, how do we say this now? Because a word that meant something now means something else.
Yeah, definitely. And so, but you brought up a very interesting point, which is one of the last parts that I'm doing, and I want to do more research in is what are, the common math terms in Arabic to a lot of different things that we use today in programming, such as lambda. What's the Arabic equivalent of that? What are the ways? Because it's one thing I can just take English programming language terms and transliterate them and say, now you have to understand them is just written in your alphabet. But it still doesn't have any inherent meaning. And so then I think one of the things that stumped me is I didn't learn calc and pre-calc and algebra 1 and trig and differential equations in Arabic. I learned it in English. And so part of my issue is that I'm coming to it from an English perspective. But if I could, find textbooks, if somebody, one of your listeners has like resources, I'd love to see and get like immersed in this myself from the Arabic perspective.
Right. Yeah. Because right now you're right. Like doing a one-to-one mapping of a keyword to a keyword is one way to design a language, and doing an idiomatic, at Arabic at its heart, without knowing an English language first, might have a different result.
Yeah. One of the things I also thinking about is as I was creating this language, some of the things that I was like debating between were, how do I go about implementing packages and modules? How do I go about doing this and that? And I was like looking at, taking a lot of different inspiration from the programming languages I used to work with. What are the best ways to teach computer science? And that's when I started to think about, it's not just text-based. It needs to be like graphical and visual feedback related and oriented into the mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a lot of things to solve here.
We're so far in the future here. We have virtual reality and pocket supercomputers. Why is it still Vim and text that we're doing all of our talking to the computer with?
Right.
And I don't have an answer either.
Yeah. And so I think that's, to make it more, palatable and easier to learn, to add things like time travel and the visual feedback. I think Khan Academy does a really good job of this. If you look at the way they teach computer science programming, they use, you can write a function to draw a rectangle, and then you can alter the arguments to that rectangle and watch it resize on the right-hand side of the screen.
Yeah. Things like the Swift Playground or Xamarin Workbooks, where you're typing and the code is always running, is definitely a better experience than the whole compile, hit refresh experience that we're having today. Cool. Well, this is great, and thank you so much for talking to me. And would you encourage other people try to write their own programming language?
Definitely, absolutely. I think once you get started, I personally found it to be really addicting, and I think it's a great way to increase your programming skills as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to put in links in the show notes to Noor, to Galib, to my article on Do You Need to Know English to Be a Programmer, as well as Peg.js and the other resources, including the book Create Your Own Programming Language that we talked about. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.